Um, I mean essentially make a. I didn't mean essentially to make kind of like a multitude of videos, entirely. But a very interesting video just came out from Alternate History Hub, talking about Trotsky and actually what if he essentially came into power of the Soviet Union instead of Stalin. Now, I'm not the one to argue for alternate history. I honestly think the very question of, or trying to argue for alternate history entirely, even as a Marxist, material that recognizes materialism entirely, is essentially just a irrelevant argument and is an irrelevant debate entirely, and just shouldn't really matter. What this entire debate is, I guess, really supposed to be as well. But the reason essentially I am making it on this video is the fact that he essentially mischaracterizes like a lot of things, from Lenin and Trotsky here, on like what Trotsky and Lenin basically means on their understandings of the Soviet Union and their implications of like Soviet history as well, I'd say is essentially being flawed here and essentially does have not understanding. Not only just this is by Alternate History Hub, but this is also essentially a phenomenon I have saw in with Cypher, the cynical historian, as well in this video. Um, now, again, I am not entirely the person that's arguing for alternate history here, entirely of this, but but like a lot of these videos essentially got a lot of things of like Trotsky and Stalin is just essentially wrong, and I am here to basically uh refute, and I'm here to basically basically just argue essentially what Trotsky actually believed in, and in some fair play, what Trotsky essentially did actually want within the Soviet Union, and how could this essentially play out, even in alternate history, which I probably won't even, which even that last part I probably won't even get into much. Hopefully I don't, at least in this video. So, yeah, without further ado, let's end this introduction and get started. Also, I should forgot to mention that Leon Trotsky was essentially a Russian revolutionary, entirely within the Soviet Union. Essentially argued for like a lot of ideas of permanent revolution and like entirely of anti-two-stage theory, basically advocating for the entirety of like ideas of a revolution to be permanent until capitalism is defeated, so that way socialism can actually be established, and that the Soviet Union was essentially just merely a worker state that needed to be done. Furthermore, that there essentially need to essentially be what he considered as true proletarian democracy, Soviet democracy, like essentially of Council of Soviets essentially taking control onto these factors, a rule of majority within the Bolshevik Party, and including the entirety of the majority as well as the population in Russia, um, economic centralization earlier within the Soviet Union, and so many more factors that essentially not mentioned in this video or just mischaracterized or like misrepresented in this video as well. And I as a neo-Trotskyist want to essentially make a response or some form of essential better understanding, or give a better understanding to people, essentially understanding this as well. So, without further ado, let's begin.
During the revolution that didn't translate into automatic political success in the head Soviet. And to be blunt, he wasn't really well liked. He was extremely opinionated, even by leftist revolutionary standards, and his general ideology didn't mesh well with the politics that were forming in Moscow.
Um, well, here's the thing, though, and here's actually one thing that I essentially have to understand about essentially people not exactly liking Trotsky or any form of that, that Cody here from Alternate History Hub is trying to essentially put on, is the fact that apparently people just didn't like Trotsky, because of his entire like ideology that didn't essentially did not happen. The context here is that really is that he's essentially talking about kind of like how would Trotsky get into power, and he's basically explaining that Stalin just wouldn't essentially have a power grab in the first place, regardless. But either way, we're talking about essentially like if it's true or not, if the people did not like Trotsky, even on leftist revolutionary standards. Well, we can actually see onto the majority of the vote of the Bolshevik Party, especially even during kind of like Lenin's time. Um, is essentially there was entirely a vote for the entirety of the understanding and for kind of like and for a better understanding for the Bolshevik Leninist faction within the Bolshevik Party based on the majority and a popular vote um by the entirety of the people themselves as well. And this was essentially done because of the fact that they were able um because of the fact that they were able to get support from the entirety of the majority of the party. And even then, majority of the members of the Bolshevik Party did support and align themselves with entirely Trotsky's positions in the Bolshevik Leninist faction. The problem is here is that the problem is here is the fact that the entirety of the ban on factions happened and essentially disawayed from the entirety of the Marxist Leninists and the quote unquote Marxist Leninists and the Bolshevik Leninists to essentially discuss and have a favored debate or even compromise and to essentially be able to have and be able to stop entirely of a bureaucracy from rising. Uh, that's the essentially that would essentially create entirely of bureaucracy and entirely of like just sectarianism and like kind of like a one side or two sided kind of approach within the Bolshevik Party that even then Lenin essentially implemented in 1921, which he would even later regret. If you have read if we are to read the 11th Congress of the revolutionary of the RCPB, I think it's called. Um, I'll look in. I'll yeah. So if you already even read that, it can even be said that like this entire function is essentially just really it can essentially be characterized as a popular vote, and even then, the majority of the people essentially liking up onto his positions into the Marxist theory. Even then, he was even widely popularized and even widely liked, even by Lenin himself as well. Only onto after he became a Bolshevik in 1917, and especially before and after his entire like inauguration or his entire thesis of trade unions within the Soviet Union that he even later backed down and even conceded and even critiqued Bukharin of even trying to essentially implement or trying to essentially popularize within the Soviet Union, calling him a state capitalist, and which he was. He was a state capitalist. Anyways, moving on to the next point.
The only evidence we do have of a massive split between Lenin and Stalin was the letter called Lenin's Testament, which called on Stalin to be removed from power. The authenticity of this letter is disputed, but even if it was faked, this piece of paper with Lenin's name on it held so much political influence, it was still a threat to Stalin's position. So if somehow Lenin, without a doubt before his stroke, politically ruined Stalin, that would have led to new candidates being available to take his place. Even with that unlikely
Well, I was about to say unlikely
scenario occurring, Trotsky needs to gain an
Okay, yeah, okay, that's going to the alternate history part. I'm not going to argue on that. One thing we have to understand, he says that this is the only kind of like massive entire split between Stalin and Lenin, which we can even see that is not the entirety of the case. We can even see entirely the 11th Congress, or when he talks about bureaucracy rising into the Soviet Union, or like rising of bureaucracy, or in the functions of a bureaucratic machine's communists, especially after they take over the entirety of the Soviet government. He's intentionally talking about kind of like something that is growing or something that is brewing within it. What is he talking about? A bureaucracy. And the proof of this is the entirety of the 11th Congress of the RCPB, which I'll even provide here. Quote: If we take Moscow with its 4,700 communists in responsible positions, and if we take that huge bureaucratic machine, that gigantic gigantic heap, we must ask, who is directing whom? I doubt very much whether it can be truthfully be said that the communists are directing that heap. To tell the truth, they are not directing, they are being directed. End quote, Vladimir Lenin in the 11th Congress of the RCPB. So we can even understand here is that, like, Lenin is saying that a bureaucratic machine and that a bureaucratic heap, as he says, is essentially brewing within the Soviet Union, and that essentially there needs to be something done to essentially stop that, and that's what he did. He tried to essentially make reforms for more proletarian democracy, more entire democratic reforms, more essentially representation for the proletariat, and to essentially reverse the ban on factions to allow the Bolshevik Leninists and the quote-unquote Marxist Leninists to essentially talk and compromise and have entirely a conclusion and entirely vote, and to stop very much the very key route that led to bureaucracy to essentially rise within the Soviet Union, and essentially would take full hold by 1925. This is where we can essentially understand. This is where we can essentially understand by that time when we essentially understand by the bureaucracy and bureaucratic machine essentially heaping or or being created under the time in this very function. Thus, meaning this is not essentially true, rather not, I guess, if there was even a split between, like, essentially Trotsky or, like, Lenin or Stalin, regardless, it's the fact that the entirety of bureaucracy was in the entirety of the rise. And the fact whether or not, at least into this context, onto the defense of Trotsky, or just defending onto, like, misconceptions of Trotsky, which is what I'm as well as doing. So, yes. Um, this is not, so this is entirely proof, not just the only kind of like massive idea, but this quote and the entirety of the 11th Congress of what he briefs of the Bolshevik Party, the rest of the Bolshevik Party on, is that yes, the bureaucracy is in the rise, and was in the rise of, like, communists essentially being directed. Of course, this was done by Stalin, the quote unquote Marxist Leninist that basically took over when the Bolshevik Leninists essentially opposed on it, and basically said that this is, well, yeah, bureaucratic, and this would essentially wouldn't be able to be function as within the Soviet Union had if any Bolshevik Leninists at all, not even Trotsky, but even Karl Radek or even Zianov would have came into power or any form of that at all. Anyways, moving on.
Trotsky needs to gain enough allies with the Central Soviet to be even considered to lead the party, which during 1922 and 24, Trotsky was certainly beaten back during sessions of the Soviet Congress by the majority. How effective this...
Well, usually, actually, most of the time, not. Onto the Soviet Congress, there's multiple representations and multiple representatives essentially elected by the people to essentially represent the entirety of the people in midst of debate or in midst of discussions of entirely of the Soviet government, essentially as effect of proletarian democracy, essentially in effect of the Soviet government. Because of this very function, they essentially, yeah, had a discussion and had essentially discussions of, like, Marxist theory, not even just Marxist theories, but even then of, like, essential political or social kind of like constructions that essentially need to be done, or economic debate that essentially would have to essentially be discussed. Trotsky, in this instance, advocated for of a centralized planned economy, even before the entirety of the times of the NEP, and essentially advocated for entire centralization of the means of production and distribution based on the hands of the workers, collective farming, and proletarian industrialization, basically leaving the industrialized hands instead of a state bureaucracy, rather by the workers themselves, public infrastructure, public industry, the anti trade essentially reform, and various other factors that essentially would leave entirely of the Soviet Union to be essentially of a worker state that it would be today, and not essentially trade with foreign powers, or even facilitate any capital, or try and create any commodity production. Instead, he would entirely abolish that, and would essentially try to industrialize Russia based onto the factors of the worker state economics. Of course, Bukharin and Stalin essentially disagreed with this onto their ideas of two-stage theory, essentially trying to develop basically the Soviet Union that would soon later become entirely the capitalist state. They argue that this is not going to happen, and that this could never happen through the entirety of the conditions of Russia, which essentially Trotsky even basically said, yes, we do have to consider the conditions of Russia, but even then we can also consider the conditions of Russia that it too has banks, denationalization of banks, capital, commodity production, industrialization onto various factors, and even on this, we can even see under this industrialization that this is the case, and that the workers are already in power in said areas all over Russia. The problem is that it still has a feudal remains within Russia, within this country. It is a backwards country, yes. The problem is that, but the thing is, we already have the proletariat taking control onto industries, and we can essentially expand that within the factors. And he essentially did look at this entirely dialectically and how this can still be applied within it, even considering the material conditions of Russia. Basically making Stalin and Bukharin look like idealists themselves while trying to make Trotsky an idealist. This essentially angered Stalin and Bukharin, which basically led him to essentially yell at Trotsky and try and basically and basically kind of like anger as of a way, and trying to call and basically calling him a centrist as of so. We can even see onto even the kind of vote on the end that Trotsky and even Trotsky essentially did get entirely of a popular vote, or get kind of like a better understanding, or kind of like a better opinionated way to him, while as Stalin and Bukharin did get the minority vote. Of course, it was essentially a very close vote. It was 52. It was essentially 52 to 48, which is actually very close considering the entirety of the consistency of the Soviet of the entirety of the national convention for the Soviet government, which is very true. However, regardless, this is essentially still a popular vote towards Trotsky in his favor. So even though onto the Central Committee, there was essentially a popular vote to Trotsky. The problem is here by 1920. The problem is here is that through the ban on factions that essentially implemented, this would lead entirely to political power. Yeah, being seized by Stalin and Bukharin essentially against Trotsky. Entirely against Trotsky and the Bolshevik Leninist faction within the Bolshevik Party and the Soviet government. This is the problem here. This is the problem that we essentially have to understand. Anyways, moving on.
Profusely, including trying to justify the Red Terror, which was when the Bolshevik secret police, called the Cheka, suppressed dissent through state terrorism and mass executions, including sending people to work camps, though they weren't called gulags yet. No wonder why he wasn't well liked, even by the party establishment. Hence, when he formed his own faction, called the Left Opposition in 1923, he further alienated himself until finally being voted out of the Central Committee in 1927 and expelled from the Soviet Union a year later. When you're
There's multiple things entirely wrong with what he just said as well, but one thing I'm going to be focusing on, especially now, at least to start off with, is that his entire, I guess, idea of the Red Terror, the quote unquote Red Terror that hit entirely within the Soviet Union by the times of the Russian Revolution and all of these factors. They always bring up kind of a secret police that was essentially established by the Soviet government that essentially took down political prisoners, it took down political executions that was essentially set up by the Bolsheviks, which we can clearly see that this didn't even happen. There's even no essentially kind of records of entirely of essentially these Chekas popping up. The Chekas were essentially the Chekas under this context was essentially weapons that was mounted onto horsebacks and to basically fire on into tanks and to enemy positions entirely. Those were essentially Chekas, or what they considered as that. It was a Russian warfare tactic that essentially helped out with the entirety of the Russian Civil War. It was especially used by the Red Army and the Black Army as well during the Russian Civil War. The Cheka, on the other hand, and what we can essentially understand by the police force, and what we have to understand under like this context of like the police force and any form or justice or law-abiding system, law-abiding or law-enforcing system by far was entirely of a position of a proletarian militia, something that Karl Marx essentially advocated for, and that Karl Marx would essentially further essentially go around onto spreading and kind of advocating for entirely the worker state to have essentially a say onto this very functions in itself without this into this very function. And this is one thing that I essentially understand. Quote, the true antithesis of the empire itself on the state power and centralized executive, with which the second empire was only exhausted formula, was the commune. It was therefore a revolution not against a legitimate legitimate republican or constitutional republican or imperialist form of state power. It was a revolution against the state itself. This is a supernatural abolition of society representation by the people for the people of its own social life. It was not a revolution to transfer it from one faction to the of the ruling class to another, but a revolution to break down this horrid machinery of domination itself. The Second Empire was definite a negation and therefore the initiation of a social revolutionary. he basically he basically like goes in on it and basically like goes in on this that calls for entirely like and he also basically says as well, quote, all France organized in self-working, self-governing communes, a standing army replaced by popular militias. The army and the state parasites removed of the hierarchical hierarchy and transformed into the communal organs of the suffrage for national representation, not as a matter of the sleight of hand for a powerful government, but the deliberate expression of the organized communes. The state functions reduced to a few functions for general national purposes. This is what essentially Karl Marx essentially advocated for and essentially intended for the function of the worker state was that essentially there wouldn't be a police force or there wouldn't be entirely a standing army or any police force. This would essentially be replaced by the hands of the proletarian militia and by the militia themselves to essentially within the worker state and even during the transformation when this would essentially happen. Even Lenin even goes in on this and actually advocates for something like this entirely of in State and Revolution. Quote, at the certain stage of the development of democracy, it first wheels together the class that wages a revolutionary struggle against capitalism, the proletariat, and enables it to crush, smash to atoms, wipe off the face of the earth, the bourgeois, even the Republican bourgeois, state machine. The standing army, the police, and the bureaucracy, and to substitute them with a more democratic state machine, but a state machine nevertheless, in the shape of an armed workers who proceed to form a militia involving the entire population. End quote, Vladimir Lenin. Now you can essentially ask like what okay, so this is essentially what Lenin said, but is this actually what happened? Well, yes, we can essentially understand that this is very much what happened within the very system and even like the very programs that was essentially even constructed and even drafted before the entire Russian Revolution and was put into practice in 1918 after they took power into the Soviet government. In the military program of the Proletarian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin says, Vladimir Lenin says, he basically even says, quote, theoretically, it would be absolutely wrong to forget that every war is essentially continued by the policy of other means, and the representative of the imperialist war. Contribution of the imperialist policies of the two groups of great powers under these policies inaugurated and fostered onto the total relationships of the imperialist era. But this is the very must also necessarily engender foster policies, struggle against the national oppression of the proletarian, struggle against the bourgeoisie, consequently of the possibility inevitably first of revolutionary national rebellions and wars, second of the proletarian wars, rebellious against the bourgeoisie, the third combination of both kinds of the revolutionary war, etc. Regardless, this essentially this would create a militia of the armed worker, the workers themselves taking onto their own arming forces and having their own national struggle and taking the entirety of the mantle of the standing army and the police force, and giving that onto the hands of the people and the masses of by which the state of the workers can essentially formulate. This was essentially put into practice by 1918 into the entirety of the Soviet government. Now you can say then this would basically mean that this would essentially be disregarded, especially by the times the Cheka was essentially established, especially when it seemed that it needs to centralize during this time. Well, we can essentially understand this, that involving the entirety of the population within this proletarian militia and all of this, even during the Russian Civil War, was essentially centralized into essentially what we would consider as the Red Army. Vladimir Lenin and even Leon Trotsky, when they considered it as the Red Army as we would see it today, they would never consider it as of a army per se. They would consider it as a militia. They would always say the workers' militia, the proletarian militia, the people's militia, the popular militia, whatever. They would always mention the word the entire militia, not entirely the standing army of the centralized army as well. This would involve the entirety of the population itself. This is only essentially disregarded by the times of 1930, I believe, when the NKVD was essentially established, and by the time of the Red Army did actually became entirely of an army by 1931, when the entirety of the Red Army was essentially established. In essentially response to response against foreign policies against the Soviet Union or anti-communist propaganda formulated entirely into the West by Stalin. Either way, we can essentially understand by Vladimir Lenin and even Leon Trotsky, because even then Leon Trotsky essentially advocated for this as well. This is what essentially this is what Trotsky's one of his what is it? One of his critiques of the Soviet Union was the fact that they had entirely of a standing army, and the fact that they entirely had a function of an army in its function when the fact that there wasn't supposed to be this, and we can essentially understand this also in these quotes. Quote, in what degree of the Soviet armed forces and the end of the second decade of their existence correspond to the type of which Bolshevik party incorporated upon to its banner? The army of the proletarian dictatorship ought to have the according program, an overly class character that is composed on the excessively of the proletariat and the semi-proletariat layers of the peasantry close to it. Only in the connection of the abolition of classes will such class army convert itself into the National Socialist militia. What he's basically saying here is that this army was essentially not even supposed to exist, and that this proletariat proletariat was essentially take control of the onto this. He continues, although postponing the coming period, the national character of the army of the party means to reject reject the militia system. On the contrary, according to the resolution of the 8th Congress, March of 1919, we are shifting. Quote, we are shifting the militia of the class basis and converting it into a Soviet militia. The aim of the military of the work is defined on the gradual creation of an army. End quote. Vladimir Lenin. So that is the step of the character, the material conditions that essentially was set for the Soviet Union, so that way we can establish a functional militia for the entirety of the liberation of the proletariat. This is something that Stalin disregarded by the times him and his little bureaucratic goons have essentially implemented within the Soviet Union by the times of Lenin's death and his horrible economic policies that devastated the Russian region. End quote. Leon Trotsky. So this is something that essentially Trotsky advocated for, and even then we can even say here that so even that we can essentially stay here. Hold on, what was the entire? So we can even say here that entirely this red terror essentially happening by a secret police force didn't essentially happen. Didn't necessarily wasn't much of a terror as of this late. Furthermore, what we essentially understand of the red terror was essentially conducted by like white army and white army like sympathizers that essentially were committing terrorism against the worker state themselves, and were trying to re-implement entirely the czarist regime that would exploit the entire the workers furthermore. So and we even committed acts of terrorism against the entire the worker state. So in some way or form, the red terror is not as much as a terror as cynical historian here would like to make it to be. Yeah, so that's one thing that we essentially have to understand here.
Though they weren't called gulags.
And essentially what he brought up was essentially basically just entirely I guess like a power grab, or kind of like that the people essentially did not like him in the entirety of the council, which I think we already essentially debunked, and basically I guess respond to that anyway. So moving on, I guess.
Which would translate into transforming what the party could become. From his exile, Trotsky's main criticism of Stalin's government was its brutish egotism. Party officials making decisions on matters they really had no experience in. A system that would define the culture of the USSR even after Stalin's death. Trotsky was a strange contradiction of ideological fanaticism, but also pragmatism. Believing the Communist Party shouldn't need to have an opinion on every matter for the nation to be a socialist state. It could, in some areas, delegate matters to experts. He did this during the Civil War, bringing in old Tsarist officers to train Red Army regiments. The old guard, in his mind, had some use in its knowledge, especially when it came to economics within the Soviet Union. He felt like those with more experience in those fields would be useful instead of party officials. So this alternate Soviet Union would ironically hire bourgeoisie experts to figure out how to balance the budget, trade, and most importantly, agriculture. Trotsky
Everything you just said, or most of the ending that you just said, was wrong. And here's why. Okay, this is essentially something that we need to tackle very much, even as a neo-Trotskyist. Essentially, what he just said, basically. What we have to essentially understand is that of British egotism or egoism, British egoism, that essentially was essentially as a criticism of the entire the Soviet government was essentially true. However, this is not exactly because entirely they did not rely into experts or like professionals in itself. The reason why is because it essentially alienated the workers entirely as well, from not just onto the labor, but entirely of the governing force, that was essentially supposed to give their liberation under the essence under the entire oppression or like the practice of proletarian democracy that essentially was not implemented by the time Stalin took over. His entire criticism here is not only the fact that entirely professions are not doing it, but also the fact that the workers are not doing any of these things. The fact that the workers themselves are not essentially taking control into these things, and the fact that the entire state bureaucracy is taking into control of the production force and the distributed force entirely, basically creating a bureaucracy, and what he would consider as a degeneration of the workers' state, or what he would just call it, a degenerated workers' state. This is essentially what Trotsky essentially also one of his entire like criticisms was for the Soviet Union. This was not essentially supposed to be replaced by hiring bourgeois people to decide on the economic policies within the Soviet Union. This is essentially just supposed to leave it upon to the workers themselves. That's what he essentially meant on his criticism of the Soviet Union. We can even see this in Revolution Betrayed, when he talks about when he does talk about the struggle of when he talks about this in chapter 4, the struggle for productivity of labor, he even specifies in the kind of rehabilitation of the Grubel. He even specifies that this entire kind of rehabilitate and this entire like derogative and this economic institution that was essentially established within the Soviet Union would essentially dissuade the entire original points of the worker state and would essentially characterize of a money and entirely of a facilitation of capital to be gained by a bureaucratic state under this function. We can definitely note this as a degeneration of the worker state in this very context. End quote. End quote. Leon Trotsky. And even also goes in on this. As well. And even goes in on this in chapter 10 of the Soviet Union in the mirror of the new constitution, Soviet and democracy. He basically says that this democracy and this entire democracy, or what they would consider as Soviet democracy, was not essentially allowing the workers themselves having the control onto the politic forces or onto the political forces in this very function, and not leaving it onto the workers themselves, instead of them directly electing people and essentially establishing onto a democratic function based onto their proletariat hands, and basically disweighing the entire functions of Soviet democracy, Soviets being workers' councils, councils of workers and peasants, and even then of proletarian democracy as well. Basically a construct that Frederick Engels and Vladimir Lenin advocated for in their works as well. This was essentially his critique as well. And we can even see this as well. Quote, the promise of the give of the Soviet people freedom to vote for those whom they want to elect is a rather poetic figure of the political formula that is not essentially implemented within the Soviet Union. The Soviet people will have the right to choose their representatives only from among candidates from who the central and local leaders present them under the flag of the party. To be sure, during the first period of the Soviet era, the Bolshevik Party was essentially supposed to give upon the workers themselves and give a body for them to choose onto the elected candidates. The Soviet Union, however, today essentially fails to do that and does not give upon to a better worker's life under its very society. But the identity of these two phenomena would be the appearance for reality. The publicity of the opposition to the parties was a temporary measure dictated of the conditions of civil war, blockaded intervention in the famine. The ruling parties, representing the period of the genuine organization of the proletarian vanguard, was living onto the full blooded inner life, a struggle of the groups of the factions of the certain degree replaced of the struggle of parties. At present, when socialism was conquered finally on an inconceivably formation of the factions is punished on the concentration punished not of the concentration camps or any of these forces, but by the fact of the proletariat themselves. The fact that the proletariat themselves would take control of this. This was not done entirely. The new entire constitution essentially implements what we consider as labor camps and firing squads, posing against the political prisoners and posing against even the people themselves. What we had essentially control of this essentially is essentially a state monopoly of an uncontrolled bureaucracy. End quote. Leon Trotsky. So. No, he wouldn't hire bourgeois people into the economics. He would essentially critique that. Furthermore, one of his also criticisms of Leon Trotsky, this should already be obvious for a fact, even when he's describing the transitional regime or the dictatorship of the proletariat, is the fact that they were trading with foreign leaders and foreign powers entirely. And because of this, the fact that this essentially happened was the fact that this entirely happened was entirely the fact that this was not of a socialist way or even a workers' state, or even a workers' state, that essentially was giving the hands of the proletariat was essentially well, not a worker state, but what you consider as a degenerate worker state. A worker state is essentially degenerated, essentially giving on the hands. This in itself would basically characterize as a would basically characterize as well a degenerate worker state under this context. But the fact that also a fact that they were trading with foreign powers and they were supposed to call themselves a worker state, which essentially facilitated capital within its regions, which is just absolutely absolutely true. But but the fact that they were essentially doing this, I'd argue, would be state capitalist. But that's a debate between me, a neo-Trotskyist, and an orthodox Trotskyist. So, anyways, moving on.
Ideological state, to Trotsky, the party still would hold the final decision in such areas. As long as the worker class and unions remain fully in charge, the Soviet Union, to Trotsky, would maintain itself as a socialist state.
No, he didn't. He simply didn't. He simply didn't. The very essence of permanent revolution as a Marxist theory is essentially against the idea that even a socialist state even exists in the first place. The idea that the worker state is essentially essentially created was not because you can't exactly have socialism in one country. You can have an economic system in one country. No, like Leon Trotsky was against this. When he adopted the theory of permanent revolution, even from Marx, it was the idea that the only way you can establish socialism is through the entirety of the workers themselves. Is for the workers taking all power from all hands in all international ways, and until all power from the bourgeoisie, from the capitalists, is essentially defeated and all given to the hands of the workers, so that way they can establish socialism. This is not a dog whistle at all, or kind of like a philosophical saying to establish. So no, he literally meant socialism cannot be established in one country, and economic systems do not function in that way. You can only have socialism once it has reached on the international level. This is literally what Trotsky essentially believed in. The dictatorship of the proletariat, essentially in this eyes, into Trotsky, was the Soviet Union, a degeneration form of the dictatorship of the proletariat, as he would call it. He even says here that even says it is true. He basically even says here, I'm trying to find it exactly. Russia was not onto the strongest or weakest link of the chain of capitalism. The president of the Soviet Union does not stand above the level of the economy, but is only onto the catch-up of the capitalist countries. If Marx called that society of which formed upon of a socialization of productive force on the advance of capitalism of its epoch, the lowest stage of capitalism, then the degeneration obviously does not apply to the Soviet Union, which is still today considerably poor in technique and the culture of the things of the life then capitalist countries. It would be true, therefore, to the name of the president of the Soviet regime, the contradictions not a socialist regime, but on the perpetuator of the regime from transitional from capitalism to socialism. Leon Trotsky is directly saying here in Revolution Betrayed, in the entirety of Chapter 3, Socialism and the State, that the state doesn't even exist under socialism. The lower phase of communism essentially ceases to exist of a state because a state is an authority of a ruling class over a non-ruling class, entirely in the Marxist theory. To say that basically he even advocated for a socialist state in a way is only under the assumptions that they have the desire to one day achieve socialism in this context, not that socialism has actually been established. Economic system is purely international. Whatever economic system you have in one country affects the entire world market. It affects the entire world economic basis. Therefore, it is impossible to transition from one economic system or transform from one economic system to another economic system in a matter of one country, in a matter of a national level. This can only be done on the international level by the hands of the proletariat themselves, if we're talking about the context from capitalism to socialism.
Believe that a constant renewal of revolutionary fervor was good, and this was what he saw as the main responsibility of the party. The party would be the ideological generator for the nation. So, to get this out of the way, the Gulag system still exists as political prisoners are put into camps. But this wasn't
Oh wait, hold on. I didn't
really anything new or unique. The Russian Empire had
Okay, wait, hold on.
had been deporting and sending political enemies into Siberia for years, and it's likely even had the White Army won the Civil War, the Gulag still would be used. Trotsky was
Alright, what I essentially understand here is that, I mean, that's kind of actually kind of like somewhat of a good question, whether or not if even Trotsky would take power, which even then he didn't even want to take power in the Soviet Union. He even directly says this, and even his enemies admitted this. Even Bukharin fucking admitted this. He didn't want to take power. What we have to understand here is that would this essentially a gulag system would exist? Well, honestly, I guess it could in a way, but it wouldn't be sending entire political prisoners or any of these functions. It would essentially just be kind of a rehabilitative wing or kind of any form of rehabilitative labor, not as essentially as brutal as Stalin would make it, but as a basically just like community service or any of that functions, but entirely into basically a less populated area, I would say. But even then, he himself knowing essentially Trotsky of his works in entire Marxist theory, and would put this into practice very much like what Lenin did in the Soviet Union before Stalin took into power. This very function, I guess, would just even then really just be based on to like just the workers themselves taking care of that, and especially Leon Trotsky being as the representative or as the figurehead of the people that the people themselves elected and that they themselves can take out of power. So even then, this is not even a question of what of Trotsky would do if he were to take power. I guess the simply put is that this would just be a question of the people, what they would do if Trotsky had took power. Really. So, yeah, again, I hate the whole fucking alternate history thing, even as a Marxist. It's so purely idealist and doesn't actually look onto the material insensitive that has actually happened in here. So don't take what I say on here, but like again, I said I might some majority agree, like essentially argue onto alternate history, but I'm just arguing onto like what just Trotsky essentially believed in here. So he did not advocate for entire gulags to happen in the Soviet Union. He did not. He advocated for a proletarian militia to take control onto the rehabilitative forces and justice forces, for them themselves to take hold on that, and essentially would not be decided by any bureaucratic machine whatsoever, rather by the hands of the proletariat themselves. So that way it can soon abolish it. So that way it can soon essentially abolish the state, once we can reach socialism, or at least the withering away of said state for said proletariat militia to essentially not essentially be able to be needed for, I guess, a state mandate to regulate in its sorts, basically. Of course, the state would essentially, I guess, have a control on the proletarian militia in a way, but it would essentially be more independent to the proletariat itself, instead of a state instead of like entire bureaucratic wing decided by a federal reserve or by a state reserve, like we see here in the United States, or in fact just any country at all with a police system. So, moving on.
So I feel this needed to be focused on at some point. But what of the Holodomor? The Holodomor, for context, was the mass starvation that took place in Ukraine between 1932 and 1933. And one of the main questions when imagining Stalin never coming to power is, would this still happen? Yes. Just not as extreme. Within the peasants, there was an upper class of landowners that hired labor to work their land, known as kulaks. As the kulaks were certainly not happy about the whole collectivizing thing, this discontent led to the Soviets labeling them as enemies of the revolution and encouraging the lower class of peasants to rise up against them. The Soviets would have cracked down on the kulaks no matter what. Trotsky was actually a main proponent in punishing the kulaks, and from his exile was shocked that Stalin went through with the plan, though he disagreed on the methods, which is really a common theme with Trotsky. The intentions are good, but I never would have done it that way. So this alternate USSR still sees the kulaks punished. What really caused the Holodomor wasn't simply these factors. It was Stalin's export of Ukrainian grain to other parts of Europe, and his crackdown to make sure no news of the famine came out. I don't imagine Trotsky would do the same approach. He was against any trade with capitalist nations, so he wouldn't need to sell off any grain. The main change is that there are resources and food that could be shared, and under Trotsky they would remain within Ukraine.
Oh, there's a lot to tackle here. Okay. Let's start out with the Holodomor. That was a shit show in itself, not gonna lie. Alright. Now, let's essentially understand, did essentially Trotsky actually advocate for a punishment of the kulaks as a class, or the kulak systems as a class? No. No, he just didn't. He absolutely did not. He essentially agreed that their class was essentially exploitive and essentially exploited the entirety of the peasantry and even the proletariat in some regards onto stealing their grain and even then stealing the entire their layer power. Not even by the means of like an industrialized industry, but by the sake, for the sake that they themselves essentially existed in a semi-feudal country with entire of capitalism and all these factors essentially played in within the very functions of within the very functions of entirely of capitalism and like also and like kind of feudal remains as well in this very function. It was a backwards country because of this. Because of this, Trotsky, in his mind, it goes back. Trotsky, in his mind, was essentially all they would need to do is essentially create entire economic reforms, entire collectivization, and force that upon to the population within the entirety of the kulaks. Essentially, not essentially killing them, or not essentially killing them, or creating a mass starvation, or a mass famine, essentially institutionalized by a government. Which even then, there's even debate if that even happened in the first place. That actually probably takes another video in itself in the later future. Might actually cover on that. So even if the question if this even happened in the first place, if even the government even did fucking like institutionalize this very system in the first place, and institutionalize starvation, but furthermore, we can essentially see that even if this is essentially true, which probably is not saying that it isn't overall, but probably is not, or probably is, who knows, even then, if we were to essentially assume that, this essentially wouldn't be a punishment. This is essentially just be economic reforms and natural economic reforms that essentially devastate their entire profits or devastate their entire grain cycle for them to essentially get that, and for them to essentially get grain from the entire hands of the peasantry, and the peasantry themselves seizing entire of like what they essentially produce and what they essentially grained out from the ground, and be given onto the hands of themselves, just based on economic reforms and economic policies that essentially would be institutionalized under the entirety of Trotsky. He even proposed this even before the times of the new economic policy. Even on the question of kulaks, where he himself even said, "Yeah, no, we don't necessarily." He never used the word punishment. He just used the word of the abstaining of power. He used the word of the forcement of the abstaining of power of production from the kulaks. He used that. He used as a way of to take away power, not by force, but because the force is already there. The force of the proletariat and the peasantry has already been established within the Soviet system. The proof of this is just the very essence of how the Soviet Union existed in the first place under Lenin. The problem is that we need to essentially practice that entirely onto our economic basis. And that's what essentially Trotsky essentially did advocate for entirely of this. This wouldn't be, I guess, a mass genocide in a way. This would just be economic reforms being taken place. Again, I'm not trying to argue for alternate history. I'm using what essentially Trotsky essentially advocated for and the entire material conditions of Russia, what has been considered, and essentially what Trotsky would argue for entirely of this. What Trotsky would have actually advocated for entirely, just based on what he has said in the past historically. So, yeah. So again, I really hate fucking arguing of alternate history. I really do. It's a weak argument. I do hate it. But under this context, essentially I am only using this onto the understanding of what Trotsky essentially did critique of the USSR and what he did actually say onto a better resolution for a functional worker state, as he put it. Anyways, moving on.
Socialism in the USSR, but it wasn't like he just ignored other communist movements around the world. He expanded Soviet influence outward, especially after World War II. So how would Trotsky be different? Trotsky, for being the intellect that he was, didn't make the smartest decisions when it came to military campaigns outside of the USSR, such as a failed invasion of Poland during the Civil War. Trotsky's foreign policy is simply less restrained and more aggressive to the outside world, even to the USSR's own detriment. I don't expect a Trotsky with the entire power of the USSR at his disposal to have any less restraint. Unlike Stalin, who anticipated something was coming and built up the military for such a threat, Trotsky would build up the military and immediately attempt to go on the warpath. Throughout the 1920s, large
Keep in mind, no, he wouldn't. He simply wouldn't. I will go into this later, but after like essentially I'm done with this when we're actually done watching this entire segment, regardless. But no, he just doesn't. Moving on.
amounts of Soviet equipment and funds would be funneled into neighboring states. First Poland, then Finland. You get the idea. If any of these revolutions failed, then the next stage would occur: military incursion. I don't know when these types of actions would begin, most likely just as soon as Trotsky took charge. Now keep in mind, in 1920s to 30s Europe, revolutions did occur, but they always failed because the common civilian either didn't want to take up arms for the revolution or was openly against it. So in all likelihood, Soviet-encouraged revolution would not be successful. It would come by foreign military force. Now, how the scenario plays out entirely depends on how the West reacts to this. Would they simply attempt to avoid war like with Nazi Germany, or instead would they immediately react and build a coalition to beat back the Soviets? I actually think that it would be the second option. Appeasement of Hitler was not just because the Allied powers didn't want to get into another war, but it was also because there was some faint illusion that Hitler might just stop at the German lands. A Trotsky invasion of Poland, however, would terrify the rest of Europe, already in the midst of anti-communist fears. Well, oh no, we have to rally everyone together in 1930s Europe. Yeah, Britain, France, and now Germany could band together to stop the Soviets.
Yeah. Because this is essentially under the assumption that even permanent revolution is a foreign policy and not just a Marxist theory describing the entirety of the transformation stage, and as well as the transformation stage with it corresponding with a political transition of a worker state, i.e., the dictatorship of the proletariat, and socialism of what it actually means. Understanding this. We're gonna move on to like what he says about World War II under this instance. Because apparently permanent revolution is a foreign policy now. For fuck's sake.
World War II, for as influential its effect on the world was, and as large as it was pretty simple ideologically wise. The Nazis were so terrible they united the communists and Western powers against a common enemy. But most of all, it played out the inevitable end of Nazism, showed that in many ways it was self-defeating, an inferno that rages for a brief moment but consumes its own fuel. So this is kind of a disturbing premise to think about. What if during the rise of fascism, the Axis didn't actually attack the Allies first? Say Trotsky showed far less restraint than Stalin and preemptively invaded Nazi Germany before Hitler was able to realize Barbarossa or even invade Poland, where the already existing anti-communist sentiment is emboldened as this Trotskyist USSR repeatedly makes ideological calls to attack other nations. So to the liberal democracies of Britain and France, all they would see is the Soviets going on the offensive before Germany does. And fearing that the Soviet military might not just stop at Germany. Instead of the common cause being against fascism, it instead would be against the Soviets. The trivialities of their local politics, at least to a 1930s Europe, wouldn't be much of a concern to the Allies. The Nazis, above all else, would be anti-communist. But Trotsky was the type who would preemptively invade, good idea or not, to take down Hitler before Germany ever reveals to the world the true horrors that it would unleash. The outcome, nature, and timescale of such a conflict I'm not going to go into much detail on. Perhaps it does end with the Nazis being overthrown, Britain and France being forced to retreat, half of Europe becoming quite similar to what it was after World War II, or maybe the war is far longer and dragged out. Allied forces being able to beat back the Soviets out of Germany after years of fighting, but never able to move into mainland Russia. But even with all their combined power, I still believe it'd be a drawn-out, back-and-forth war in the center of Europe, going on until finally the atomic bomb is developed. Say the bomb is invented, and the Soviets are beaten back after Moscow and Leningrad face atomic blasts. Or maybe far more cities by the time the war is done. But really, it's up in the air how much.
Holy shit. Here we go. Alright. Now, we're just gonna essentially explain permanent revolution here. And if you don't mind, we're essentially gonna explain entirely what permanent revolution essentially means, under this very context here, of what entirely this means. So, we have to ask, is permanent revolution entirely a foreign policy developed by Trotsky to under the assumption that this would essentially be implemented within the Soviet system as of a foreign policy? No. No. He never believed on that. He never said that this was entirely be a foreign philosophy. This Marxist theory was essentially supposed to describe the entire transformation and the transitional state of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and essentially what needed to be done for entirely of socialism to be established. Not of the means of revolution, but the fact that the revolution would have to be international and permanent. And he gets this idea, and even, not he himself even says this, but even Karl Marx says this. And we can even understand this in the address of the Central Communist Committee, quote, to make the revolution permanent until all the more or less property classes have been driven from their ruling positions, until the proletariat has conquered state power, and until the association of the proletarians has progressed significantly far, not only in one country, but in all the leading countries of the world. That competition between the proletarians of these countries ceases, and at least the decisive forces of production are concentrated into the hands of the workers. End quote, Karl Marx. So even then, Karl Marx is even saying here that this revolution would be onto the international proletariat, even then would be onto the proletarian functions, even without entirely of a even without this, without kind of like a state or without kind of like this happening in one country, or this essentially being a various I guess bureaucratic way striving on this, and wouldn't be essentially a national level or be a national revolution. This would essentially just be an international revolution until capitalism is can be able to essentially can be defeated by the hands of the workers themselves. Frederick Engels even goes into this in the 19th question. Will it be possible for this revolution to take place in one country alone? Quote, will it be possible for this revolution to take place in one country alone? No. By creating the world market, big industry has already brought all peoples of the earth, especially of the civilized peoples, into such close relation with one another that none is independent on what happens to the others. Further, it has coordinated the social development of the civilized countries in such an extent that in all of them, bourgeoisie and proletariat have become the decisive classes, and the struggle between them and the great struggle of the day it follows of the communist revolution will not merely be a national phenomenon, but must take place simultaneously in all civilized countries. That is to say that at least in England, America, France, and Germany, it will develop in each of these countries more or less rapidly according as one country or the other has a more developed industry, greater wealth, a more significant mass of productive forces, Hence, it will go to the slowest and will meet under the most obstacles in Germany, most rapidly into the with the fewest difficulties in England. It will have a powerful impact onto the under countries of the world, and this will radically alter the course of the development which they have followed up to now, while greatly stepping in its pace. It's a universal revolution, and it will accordingly have a universal range. End quote. Frederick Engels in Principles of Communism. So we have to essentially ask ourselves, okay, so this is just permanent revolution, then why essentially did he brought it up? Because the very question itself was essentially brought up in opposition to socialism in one country. Idea that Stalin has developed into entirely of his thesis and entirely of his theory. Rather a fact that this entire thought was essentially developed by Stalin to try and say that the Soviet Union was socialist, or that entirely was socialist, regardless of them having commodity production and these factors, regardless, or any like bureaucratic state. This in its critique is essentially just the fact that they essentially dissuade from the Marxist theory that Karl Marx, Frederick Engels, and Vladimir Lenin intended it to be. And yes, Vladimir Lenin also even mean by this as well, in describing upon like what revolution should look like, or at least revolutions entirely should be, under this like very instance. Under this very instance, you can even see this in his speech to peasants and workers. Quote, "No one, I think, in studying the question of the economic system of Russia has denied the transitional character, nor I think has the communists denied of the term Socialist Soviet Republic implies the determination of Soviet power to achieve the transition to socialism, and not that a new economic system is recognized as a socialist order." End quote. Vladimir Lenin. So this is essentially just what Lenin and Karl Marx essentially mean, and like even Frederick Engels essentially mean onto this revolution. And this was exactly what was essentially Trotsky was trying to defend. Trotsky trying to defend onto the Marxist theory between the question of socialism in one country and permanent revolution. Now, as of a foreign policy, Stalin may have essentially tried to make socialism as of a foreign policy to his citizens, but entirely this was a question of Marxist theory. A very important one, I'd say, to basically stop bureaucracy. So what we have to understand here is that, or like stop entirely of like accumulation of socialist accumulation and exploiting workers entirely on socialism. So yeah, we have to essentially understand here that, so what is socialism? Isn't socialism a workers' ownership of the means of production? That can be done in one country, right? Well, it's somewhat the case. That's one of the foundations onto socialism. However, it doesn't define socialism as it is in itself. A worker's owning the means of production a worker's ownership of the means of production, even socialism, doesn't even exist, because the question is that if even socialism has classes or not, which we can even ask if it did. Wait, it's like you're describing communism. Yes, socialism is lower phase of communism. Further, that is even what Vladimir Lenin intended it to be, and even understood when Karl Marx essentially differentiated between socialism and communism. Vladimir Lenin even says, quote, "Socialism means the abolition of classes. The dictatorship of the proletariat has done all it could to abolish classes, but classes cannot be abolished in one stroke, and classes still remain and will remain in the era of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The dictatorship will become unnecessary when classes disappear." End quote. Vladimir Lenin in the economics and politics of the era of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So this is essentially what essentially Lenin believed in as of socialism, understanding of this. Furthermore, we can even understand of like even what Karl Marx essentially believed in of socialism, or the lower phase of communism as well. In critique of the Gotha program, when he essentially trying to essentially find try and describe the lower phase of communism, which we can even find what we had to here as well, is here in this quote, "What we have to deal with here is a communist society, but not as it developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, that just as it emerges from capitalist society." which is thus in every respect, economically, morally, and intellectually, still stands as the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. Accordingly to the individual, producer receives onto the back from society. Other dedications have been made exactly of which he gives it. Or he is given onto the individual quantum of labor. For example, the social working day consists of some of the individual hours of hours of work of the individual labor time of the individual producer is a part of the social working day contributed by him in his share in it. And by him, his share in it. He receives a certificate from society, which he's furnished such and such an amount of labor after deducting his labor of the common funds. And with his certificate, he draws from the social stock of the means of consumption as much as the same amount of labor costs. The same amount of labor which he has given society in one form, he receives back in another. End quote.